What I'll try to do here is give a little bit of the overall structure and system that allows both the reality that Danielle was speaking about of the militarization inside Israeli society, but in effect also the reality that Ivan was talking about earlier of the reality of occupation, and how do Israelis come to the point where they're willing to actively implement those policies. And that starts from a very young age. It starts literally when you open your door in the morning and walk out to the street. I know some of you must have been in Israel, Palestine, knowing the Tree of Life Foundation. So at least some of you have walked through Jerusalem, for instance, West Jerusalem. If you walk through any Israeli city, one of the first things you'd notice as Americans, as people not from there, is the amount of guns on the street. Literally everywhere you walk, you'll see M16s on 18-year-old kids. 18-year-old soldiers, when they go out on the weekend home from vacation from the army, they take their M16s with them. And often you'll be sitting in a pub on a Friday night and you'll have a gun next to you. So this idea that weapons are literally all around us. The pictures that you see above me, one of them is of a soldier just standing in line to get something to eat, and again with his rifle with him. And the other one is in the city of Beersheba down south. This is just a way of the mayor to decorate the city with a fighter jet, a decommissioned fighter jet, and yet. So the idea is that everywhere you walk, one of the first things that we know is that there's really weapons everywhere. If we take another example of this, if you look at the picture to the left of you, that's a sheet that a friend of mine took a picture of. His daughter was given that in kindergarten to learn how to count. And as you can see, you have on the one side the numbers from 1 to 10, and on the other side symbols. Only the symbols that were chosen here, instead of, I don't know, chickens and cows, you have here tanks and airplanes, and the symbol of the Israeli Defense Force, the last line, the number 2, is the symbol of the Israeli Defense Force. And in the same piece of paper, you have the olive branches, you have doves, and it doesn't seem to make much sense to us, does it? I don't know if you can recognize the rest of the things on that piece of paper, but it includes Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the Star of David, the symbol of the Israeli state, the flag of Israel. And if any of you would have to guess, what does this represent? What do all of these have in common? What was the person putting this together thinking? Any thoughts? Nationalism. Making militarization normal. It's exactly what it is. If, in a snapshot, this is Israel. Whoever was thinking it was just thinking Israeli symbols. And they include the military, and they obviously include peace, and there's absolutely no contradiction between the two. And I don't know if you've ever looked at the symbol of the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli military. The symbol is a sword with an olive branch wrapped around it. There's no contradiction between peace and war. On the contrary, they very much lead to each other. If we go back in the education system, already from a very, very young age in elementary school, we have something called teacher soldiers. As Israeli society has conscription, that also means that the Israeli military has excessive manpower, because really there is no need for so many soldiers. So one of the things that they started very early on is the educational corps. And the educational corps, among other things, goes and teaches in schools, usually underprivileged schools that don't have enough staffing. So you would have an 18-year-old teacher that happens to be a soldier on uniform teaching you math or Hebrew or English or any of the normal classes that you take. But what you get from that as a child, that your teacher is on uniform in class. The other picture that you can see here with a soldier with a gun in a classroom was taken in a middle school in Israel in a leadership program. And this is the cheapest way to bring a leadership program to your school, is to bring the army, but it's also the best way, because what better leadership can you possibly show than an officer, right? That's the kind of leadership you want your students to take. So kids from a very young age have this idea that the military is literally everywhere. I can tell you that when I went to school, my elementary school had a plaque in the entrance to it with the name of all the soldiers who died from our school. So as, 7-year-old kids going into school, that's the first thing that we saw. In the 12th grade, when we're 12 in the 6th grade, that's usually the class that's responsible for the ceremonies in schools. And one of the ceremonies is the Soldiers' Memorial Ceremony. And so we would go up in front of all of our school at the age of 12 and read out the names of all the soldiers from our schools who died in the military. So it makes this whole experience very personalized. The idea not only of military service that's expected from you, but also of the ultimate sacrifice you might have to pay. By the time we're in high school, in the 11th grade, you literally have a week of basic training that you go out with your class to a military camp as part of school activity, and you wear a uniform, you learn how to take orders, you learn how to shoot, and this is all part of school activity. So if that's been your education, by the time you're 18 and you're conscripted, nobody's asking you, do you want to serve in the army or not, there's a law that forces you to, then you've never asked yourself if you should or shouldn't go to the army. It's the default solution. But if that isn't enough, then I think one of the other things that's very important to remember is the narrative that we grow up with. And this has to do with a kind of historical narrative, the national narrative. And I brought a little example of this. The picture that you see to your right is the head of the South District of the Ministry of Education, the woman on the right, and the head of the South District of the Israeli Defense Force, the man on your left. This general was retiring, and for his retiring party, the Ministry of Education person invited him for a goodbye ceremony to thank him for their collaboration throughout the years, which already should raise some question marks. Why is there collaboration, and why is it so obvious he needs to thank him for it? But other than that, what's interesting in that picture is the framed picture that the general brought this education woman. I don't know how much you can see it, but this is his goodbye present. And what you see there is 3 images. The far left is an image, it's actually a sculpture in the old city in Jerusalem of Jewish people back in the destruction of the Second Temple, carrying out the relics from the Second Temple. So this is obviously a story of religious historical persecution of Jews. The second picture is the iconic picture from the ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, of the little kid surrendering. Again, I don't know how well you can see it, but obviously a picture that represents the Holocaust. And the last picture is the picture of the paratroopers in 1967 at the Wailing Wall after the occupation of Jerusalem. Now, these 3 pictures tell a story that we are repeated all the time, and the story is there has been historical persecution of Jews throughout time. The Holocaust is the best example of that, and today we have an army that can protect us. Today we are strong enough to stand on our own feet. And that narrative also, the best example of it is in the Hebrew calendar. There's a month between April and May that starts with Passover, and as I'm in a church, I'm sure you all know the story of Passover. The Exodus from Egypt. It's seen not only as its liberation of persecution, that's what's going on there, but it's also seen as kind of the place in which the people of Israel are created as a nation. And they're created out of persecution. And the song that we sing in the Passover dinner would roughly translate into, in every generation someone tries to exterminate us. That's what you remember out of that holiday. And a week after Passover ends is the Holocaust Memorial Day. A week after that is the Soldiers' Memorial Day, and the following morning is Independence Day. It's exactly the same narrative again. Historically, everyone has always tried to kill us. It's part of the Jewish identity. The Holocaust is the best example of that, and people had to fight and die for you to be here today. And us, growing up, I grew up in Jerusalem in the Second Intifada, and I was told that people have always tried to kill me, and we would walk out the streets and people were trying to kill us. We had buses blowing up. But what this story meant was that I never had to ask myself why. Why would someone come into the middle of the city and blow themselves up? I didn't have to ask myself because I knew why. That's what people do. That's history. That's just the way things are. There was a plaque in a school, elementary school, a year and a half ago, around that same season in April and May, which said in the middle, nice big letters, "Who tried to kill us?" And then you have these different lines of different people who tried to kill us. So you had the Greek and the Romans, and you had the Egyptians, and you had Ahmadinejad, and you had the Arabs, and you had Hitler, and this combination of religious, historical, I mean, everything you can think about, which just leaves you with this idea that you don't need to think, why is something happening? You don't need to ask yourself, what's happening in the other side of my city? I mean, I grew up in Jerusalem. 40% of my city don't have the right to vote. I never knew that. I didn't have to ask myself, why are they frustrated about that situation? Because it was just a given. If we continue on from the enlistment itself, so we have this 18-year-old kid, that's what he's been taught his whole life. He spends his time in the army or chooses not to, but there's also a lot of social effects of militarization. And one of them is that in Israel, the idea of military service is part of your citizenship identity. It's part of what it means to be a citizen. This is from the webpage of Israel Beitenu. It's an Israeli political party. It ran together with the Likud, the ruling party. Lieberman, who you might have heard of, is the head of that party. And this is what they write about a law that they want to pass accepting new citizens into the state. Every new citizen must accept the obligation to serve in the country in the IDF or National Civilian Service. Only those who sign the declaration will be entitled to full citizenship rights. Now, this hasn't passed, but this is the rhetoric. The rhetoric is if you don't serve in the army, you don't deserve to be an equal citizen. Now, this is problematic for a lot of different reasons. One of them is that today over 50% of the citizens of Israel don't serve in the army. About 20% of them are Palestinian citizens of Israel who are automatically exempt from military service, and therefore all these policies against people who don't serve in the army automatically discriminate against them. The other group is Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews, which again are automatically exempt. And then you have about 12% of Israeli society who either don't start or don't finish their military service on the grounds of mental health. Now, mental health is our way to go to Canada. It's the easiest way out of military service. And it's very common, so people who don't want to go for whatever reason, that's the way that they choose. What we can see here behind us is that the Palestinian community is now mobilizing around this discrimination that is intertwined with military service. There's an attempt, a growing attempt by the Israeli government to try to conscript Palestinian Christians. This year was the first year that Palestinian Christian youngsters at the age of 17 got call-up orders. They're still not mandatory, but it's the first year they got call-up orders. It's very clear that this is something that's going to be changing within Israel. And there's a very big opposition to that on the Palestinian side, saying two things. First of all, we're not equal citizens. We don't have equal rights. Why should we even have equal duties? And then the second layer of that is even if we were willing to have equal duties, even if we had equal rights, we're not willing to fight our own people. We are Palestinian. What your army does is fight Palestinians. You can't ask us to be a part of that. So the poster that you see to your left is a campaign of a Palestinian organization called Baladna that is against that conscription. But what you see to your right is a Druze refuser. Druze are the only, it's an ethnic religious minority in Israel. It's the only part of Israeli society, Palestinian Israeli society, that is conscripted into the army. And they're a good example of how even though they do have equal duties, they're conscripted into the army, they still don't have equal rights. They're still treated as Palestinians. So that whole equation of equal rights and equal duties is a complete farce that's just used as a legitimate way to discriminate Palestinians. So the guy we see there playing the violin on the right, his name is Omar Saad. He just got out of more than 7 months in military prison for refusing, and the refusal movement within the Druze sector is now growing, so it's a very interesting development that's happening lately. Now, the last subject I'll touch upon is the whole question of the militarized economy in Israel. And this will also lead us back to Gaza and what Ivan was talking about at the beginning. When we look at the Israeli economy, first of all, you can see that the percentage of the budget that Israel spends on military spendings is over 20%. Over 20% is just the defense budget itself. You have other smaller budgets, the interior security budget, the budget of the Mossad, our equivalent of the CIA, is also not here. So it's actually bigger than that. But if we take that as percentage of our GDP, of our gross domestic product, then you can see on the chart there that Israel is the fourth biggest spenders in percentage from GDP, with 6.2% of our GDP spent on military spendings. The US, you can find yourself, you're on 4.4. You're not in such a good place either. The world average is 2.5. But still, Israel is a huge spender, but it also has a huge income from the military industry, and that's the very interesting part. Israel today is, for the last decade, has been in the top 10 military exporters in the world. Now, this is not in percentage, not per capita, in absolute numbers, which means it's a huge military economy. Per capita, Israel is the #1 weapons exporter in the world, and we're also the #1 drone exporter in the world right now. Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot about drones here. I assure you that you use them even more than we do. But a lot of the drones that you're using come from Israel. And the reason that Israel can be such a good weapons exporter, and this is also true specifically for drones, is because unlike other countries, we can actually prove that they work. And so the way that this thing works, you can see the quote here from a former marketer of a military company who says, "A scenario in which there won't be a large military operation for 20 years will severely hurt the arms industries. How sad for them." And the reason for that, you can see here the numbers of the Israeli military economy growing every single year. The list of companies there, Elbit, Israeli Military Industries, and Rafael are the biggest military companies. They can prove their weapons work because they test them once in a while, very, very publicly. So if you look here, you can find the list of weapons that were made operational and made their first operational debut this summer in Gaza. And those are just the ones who made their first operational debut. You all heard about Iron Dome, other countries are buying it, the drones that we're selling. You can see here a poster of one of the military companies. It actually says on the poster, battle proven. That's how we market our weapons, they're battle proven. Now what this means is that Israel today has a huge economic interest to continue the occupation. Because if we don't do an operation in Gaza once in a while, then you won't buy those drones. If we don't build a fence between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, then when the US wants to build their fence in Arizona, then you won't use our technology. But luckily, we did build a fence, and you can buy the same technology. And the companies that are building the fence now in Arizona are the same ones that were doing the same in Israel before. Today, there's not a single state in the United States whose police departments do not train with Israel. So it's not only with the weapons, but also the trainings. You all send your cops to learn how to do riot control back home. And then you get that back in Ferguson. Thank you. Here you can see both the picture of the wall in Arizona. Again, an Israeli company was building all the electricity around that, Elbit Systems. On the other side, you can see armored vehicles, Israeli Defense Force armored vehicles, patrolling the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. This is a global industry. But if we go back to Ferguson for a second, a lot of the cops in Ferguson actually received training, well, at least in St. Louis, received trainings from the Israeli police. But the good side of this, the bright side of this, was that because the same tear gas that was used in Ferguson is the one that's used in Palestine, Palestinian activists were able to help people in Ferguson. So you see these tweets of Palestinian activists telling the protesters how to get away from the tear gas, how to have its effects minimized as much as possible. And the reason that I wanted to end specifically with this slide is that for me, this is kind of the optimistic part of that whole military industry complex, because it's a very big system. And we all feel very small next to it. I mean, those are numbers that none of us can ever imagine or understand what they mean. Someone was mentioning here before the US military aid to Israel is $3 billion a year. Those are numbers that most of us have no idea how to even understand them. That said, because of this globalized military economy, then there's also a globalized, Jeff Halper from the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions likes to call it Palestinizing other places in the world. Ferguson became like Palestine, in a sense. The same weapons were used. But what that creates is also a lot of people who have in common these mechanisms of oppression, and on that level can resist them in common. And when we understand that system, we can do that. The other part of that is understanding that, like any other economic issue, it's a question of money. And as long as people keep buying it, as long as people keep supporting it, then it'll work. But the moment that, for instance, Spain this summer decided to stop selling weapons to Israel, that has a huge economic effect. Those things can shift. And this is where we can leave it to you over here. There's a whole economy, and the military economy is probably the hardest part of it, but there's a whole economy of the occupation, settlement products, the different companies that the UCC the Connecticut UCC just decided to divest from, that you can all affect this huge economic system. So I'll leave it at that, as asking you to help us, and understanding that this will also, at the end, come back to you. So try to help it while it's still only hurting Palestine and before it comes to the US too fast. So thank you all.